I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I have been practicing yoga for 46 years. My mother introduced me to yoga, so you guys can do the math here, when I was 3 years old. And she was I'm Canadian. I'll say out and about so you guys can hear that. But my mom came to Canada, I'm Canadian, in the late 60s from England by way of Barbados, and moved to a very small rural town in Canada and felt very, very isolated. She had 3 children under the age of 4, new country, new customs, and was at home, didn't drive, didn't have any friends, trying to acclimatize to her life as a new mom. And so she needed, some coping skills. She couldn't go out and take a fitness class. She couldn't go out and leave us alone because we were very young. And so she got this book from the library called Stay Young with Yoga. Has anybody heard of it? It's been out of print for quite some time. And for a long time, I thought I was making that book up until about 2 or 3 years ago. I saw somebody post it on Instagram, a picture of this book. And the Stay Young with Yoga book featured people in interesting outfits doing interesting poses. And my mother was enthralled with it. So being the precocious 3-year-old that I was watching my mother do all these interesting movements on the floor, and I wanted to be a part of it. So when she put my brother and sister down for their nap, she would put them in this bassinet that looked like a laundry basket, and she would bring them downstairs to our recreation room, that's what we called it in the 70s, and she would put them next to the sofa while they were sleeping, and the 2 of us would open this book and emulate these poses. We tried this one, and we tried that one, and we tried this one, and we tried that one. And it became this really beautiful experience that my mother and I shared. And the more she did these poses, the more she wanted to know more. So she started reading and sharing meditation and philosophy for how to live our lives. And as a family of color, as people of color, I know you look at me and you see perhaps an African American, but I am not. I am of African descent. 79% of my DNA says so. But I am of African descent, of Caribbean African descent. And we felt very isolated where we lived. I didn't see anybody that looked like me until I went to high school. So that's a really hard thing to live with, is to never see yourself represented anywhere. And I especially didn't see myself represented in yoga. The very first time I saw a mainstream yoga publication, it didn't look like anything other than an issue of Vogue magazine with people doing poses in beautiful outfits and telling me how I could get thinner with diet pills or stay smaller in my body. It didn't seem to me that what my mother and I practiced in the basement all those years ago was for me, because I never saw anybody who was either plus-sized, a person of color, practicing yoga. For me, my first practice started with getting a runner. Do you guys know, like, when you have like hardwood floor stairs or tile stairs, you go to the hardware store, you get that runner that's got the rubber on the back of it and the carpet on the front of it? Those were our yoga mats. We would go to the hardware store and get yoga mats cut. And we would roll them out, and we would just enjoy moving in our body and having a moment that was just ours. And then I decided when I went off to college that I would try yoga outside of this experience with my mother, outside of a personal practice that I had cultivated for some 20 plus years. And I went to my very first yoga studio, and I walked up to the desk to fill out the waiver. And the woman at the desk, who looked to be about 10, looked me over and said, "You know this is gonna be hard, right?" Making an assumption, because I was in a much larger body than I am in now, that because I was in a plus-size body, and because I was perhaps new to the studio, that I didn't quite belong. I wasn't gonna be able to keep up. And I thought to myself, I have probably been doing yoga longer than you've been alive, but that's okay, that's all right. You can have your judgments. I really thought this was a judgment-free zone. I really thought that we were going to be mindful and not make an assumption about what we saw. But this was my experience of my first step into a yoga studio space. And I thought to myself, if I were going to share yoga, what would it look like for me to share it? Because when I stepped into that space, I was the biggest, brownest spot in the room, and everybody let me know about it. People moved their mats. People stop talking. People make judgments in a judgment-free space. So as we all sit together and do our practice, and then at the end of practice, we bow and we say namaste, do we actually mean it? Does the light in you actually see the light in me? Because at the core root of that, isn't that what we're doing? Aren't we acknowledging each other's humanity? Aren't we connecting to a supreme consciousness that moves beyond expensive yoga mats and yoga pants and yoga poses and complicated arm balances? Isn't it more than just that? Isn't it seeing the light in me? Isn't it asking for my humanity to be recognized? So I left that studio feeling less than stellar. And it is in my dharma, or my constitution, or my personality, to do something when I see injustice. So I decided to open a yoga studio, just like that. I thought to myself, if I wasn't going to be represented in the spaces in my city, that I was going to be the representation. So I opened a yoga studio in a low-income neighborhood, and I put my picture of my plus-size body all over my advertising, and guess what happened? People who look like me came to yoga. And you know what they said to me? I have never seen anybody that looks like me at yoga. Thank you. And coming from a population that has been pushed to the margins, it was a rewarding place to be pulled to the center, to look out in my yoga classes and see a plethora of bodies represented. So I thought, if I could do this here, I could do this anywhere. So I wrote 50 letters to yoga studios all over North America, from Canada all the way through the US, maybe a couple in Mexico. And this is 2012. And I got 49 rejections. It's an interesting concept, this yoga and diversity thing, but it's not really what we're into right now. And I thought to myself, that's fine, that's okay. You don't want to, we don't really, that's great that you want to offer yoga to plus-size bodies, but, I know how to do adjustments, I'm good. And I said, okay, that's great. I will stay in my little town, and I will do what I can where I am. But one yoga studio got back to me and said, thank God. We have been looking out into our yoga spaces and seeing the exact same kind of person coming to the mat every single time. And if we really want to do yoga, we want to serve everyone. And maybe you can help us figure out what are some of the invisible barriers that are keeping people that look different than our current clientele from yoga. And I said, I would be happy to come. So I packed myself off and flew off to Ottawa and did my very first Yoga for All workshop. And what was interesting to me is, once again, I was the only person of color in the room, talking to what I call the dominant culture. And when I refer to the dominant culture, it is the people who have always had access to everything. It is the people who have always had access to all of the resources, who've always had the privilege of being judged by their character and not by the color of their skin, have always been given the benefit of the doubt in all situations, have never had to really fear the police or fear that they won't be believed simply because of the color of their skin. And I wanted to communicate to that group of yoga teachers that those types of attitudes are biased against gender, skin color, socioeconomic class, shows up here on the yoga mat. Because the yoga mat is a microcosm of what goes on in the larger culture. We bring all our bias, we bring all our beliefs, and we bring all that to the mat. And yet we say, namaste. The light in me sees the light in you. Does it? Now, when you talk to people about their bias, they get uncomfortable. They don't want to hear it because essentially we believe we are good people. We believe we've done the work of self-study. But what we don't understand is that internal bias is something that is taught to us from the beginning of time. In all our textbooks, on all our TV shows, in all our popular culture, we are taught there is us and there is them, that this is better than that. It is a structural thing. We always reduce bigotry and racism to individual mean-spirited actions, but we often don't look at the bigger structural context of all the places where people are othered, and that happens on the yoga mat, whether it's your size, your skin color, or your gender. And we are too afraid to look at ourselves truthfully, because maybe then, if we believe this, we're bad people. And that's not the case. We're just unconscious. We've just drank the Kool-Aid. When we were taught this, we were all in the same room together, and we all participate in the narrative that is white supremacy. So how do we start to unpack our unconscious bias? It has to become a conscious bias. And what does that mean? That means you have to do your self-study. That means when you see someone and you instantly make a judgment, you have to pause, because that's the yoga. And you have to ask yourself, why do I believe that about that person by simply looking at them? Is it because I've had a prior experience with somebody who looks like that? Is it because I've been taught this by my parents, my family, by society? And how do I continue to perpetuate harm to groups of people based on a belief that I haven't bothered to unpack or ask myself about because I feel like that will make me a bad person? If we want to tackle inequality and injustice, it has to start with us. When we look out into our yoga classes and we don't see anybody who looks different than us, we have to ask the question, why? What is it that I'm doing or not doing that makes this space feel exclusive? Here's the truth. Diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a choice. So will you make the choice to make a space that is not only socioeconomically available to people, physically available to people, emotionally available to people, and to all people? Not just those of us who have physical privilege, economic privilege, white privilege. It's okay. You were born into the body that you were born into. It happens. This is the world. But how will you use your platform, your privilege, your standing in the world to make it a better place? How will you learn about yourself and break down some of the barriers that keep the rest of us out? Stop making yoga look like this exclusive club for the able-bodied, for the wealthy. Using yoga as a charity to dole out to people because we own it and nobody else does. Because that's what it looks like to a lot of us who reside at the margins. That's not something we do because we don't see ourselves represented. So I've been given a beautiful opportunity and a wonderful platform to show the world that yoga looks all kinds of ways. I started a 200-hour teacher training that focused on creating diversity, brave spaces for people to come to class. I've gone into underrepresented communities and taught students to become yoga teachers so they could go back into their community and serve. I don't go to their community as a savior and serve. I teach somebody from their community to serve their own community, right? I talk to people like you, and I ask you to explore your own bias. And I ask you to switch your unconscious bias to a conscious bias and begin to unpack what you believe when you see somebody that looks like me, when you see somebody that is different than you. How do you engage? How do you open up? How do you truly say, namaste? Thank you.